So the shaila of the Maimah is, why does it have to be this trembling and dread before Matan Torah? The answer is, it's the letting go of the self in order for an entirely new order of self to emerge. And that's a principle, that before there can be a radically new entity, the old has to give way, has to be nullified. Again, the classic example is the seed that germinates, literally rots, in order to produce the great tree. And likewise, in many other examples, the classic example also brought in Chassidus is the story of Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera lived in Bavel, and he was going to Yisrael, to move to Yisrael and become part of the body of sages in Yisrael. So he fasted 40, another opinion says 100 fasts, to forget Talmud Bavli, as achana to go to Yisrael and become part of the Ifan al-Limud, but they learn in Yisrael. So that's a preparation to go to a higher level of learning, to forget what you learned in the country. You want to review it and master it even more so. The answer is, that's if you're going from one grade to the next. Yeah, so if you like in school, high school, whatever it is, in anything, if it's steps and graded, sure, you can't get to the next step without the step below. That's the step. But here, the learning of Torah in Yisrael is radically different. Radically different. He can't come in with that mindset of Talmud Bavli. He won't get a word. He just end up being totally confused. He had to forget it and cleanse his mind of that whole Eifan of Limud in Bavli, which is kashas and contradictions and so on. And Yerushalmi, it's oil, it's light, it's a much higher, it's like Bina versus Chachma. So he had to forget Talmud Bavli in order to open his mind, clear his mind, to be able to learn and perceive on the level of Talmud Yerushalmi, which is radically beyond. So when there's a radical change, not just tweaking. Tweak, you need the old order, on the contrary. You're building on it. We're not talking about building on it, we're talking about a whole radical new order. So that means that the old state needs to be abandoned. That's all Pesach also. It explains the three names of the Yontif. Minater, it's called Chag HaMatzos, and then Midrabanan, it's called Zman Cheruseinu, and the colloquial name is Pesach. It's 3 stages in true radical growth. Then the first one is Matzah, Bittul. Got to let go of the old order. Can't come in with the old mindset. And from that Bittul, Matzah, then Chedus, and Pesach, as he goes on to explain. So that's the Nakud of the answer. Now, the way he expressed the answer. So what's the new Metzius that's happening here? What's new? As we mentioned before, there was no new information. The Ovis learned the entire Torah. And we're Makayim it, even Erev Tafshilin, which the Chacham were Misaken, says the Gemara. So there's nothing new. So what are we talking about? The answer is there's no new information. So what's new? The new is the Yid. The Yid is radically transformed. In halacha, from Ben Noach to a Yid, this was the Gedus. No, this is not the words of the Maimar at all, but this is what he's saying. What the words of the Maimar is, can someone tell me? How does the Maimar describe in 3 words the radical change that happens on Matan Torah? It's right there in the first paragraph. Just the subject now of the whole entire Maimar. Little more detail. Gilui Oir Atzmi, where, to whom, what, who, when. To Neshamas Yisrael, and then he qualifies that. That's a vague, very general statement. Dahainu, that's the Dahainu, it's these next 2 words actually, that the whole Maimar is out to explain. And what are those next few words? What's the nature? How is this Gilui Oir Atzmi defined? It is what? No, but yes, but what is it? Kav Emtsoi, right? The middle. This is the whole thing we're explaining now. Tiferes, the middle kav, as opposed to the right and the left, as we explained yesterday. The middle kav, Torah, Yaakov, and the right is Chesed, and the left is, as we know, Yitzchak Gevurah, just to use a related model. So the etzem, what's he saying? He's saying the etzem is drawn, is expressed not in the right kav, not in Chesed, and not in Gevurah, but the etzem is expressed and drawn, and now being invested, or better, more accurately put, unlocked in the Shomes Yisrael. And this middle kav is, he calls it the kav atzmi, and then adds the next cryptic words, which is the Maimon really is going to unravel, is the kav emtzoi differs from the right kav and the left, in as much, that's what I want to fill in the blank, that the kav emtzoi is what? Someone just said it before. It's the same uniformly from top to bottom. So how did we already address this yesterday to some degree in answering that? In contrast to Chesed and Gevurah. Pardon?
It's about the other.
Yeah, it's about the other. Yeah, that's the explanation of what sets it apart. But now we're talking about where you see the distinction, where you do see the ischalkos, the change on the right and the left, but no change in the center. We have to still address. The Maimon is going to address for me. There's no change in the center. There's a tzimtzum. We're going to talk about it. But first, there's oiris and kalim. So there's change. The light diminishes. The keli becomes stronger. There's hamshacha. What does this mean? But we said already yesterday, the change, which the Maimon will make, I think, actually say, I don't know. No, it doesn't. But the change that we see, for example, right and left, very radical, dramatic change. We mentioned it yesterday. Avraham and Yitzchak. Where's a radical compromise and change, not a virtuous one, an unvirtuous change that comes as a result of pure chesed and pure gevurah. What's going to happen? Inevitably, pure chesed is going to produce down the road something negative, and so will pure gevurah. Only Tiferes doesn't. That's already beginning of no change. It's right on target throughout. But where do we see that chesed and gevurah will produce a corrupted result? Yishmael and Esav. Pure chesed produces what? Let's use pure English for a McGill student. The indulged, a spoiled child. That's Yishmael. It's the Arab world. It's a sensuous pleasure before everything world. And what does Yitzchak produce? Violent, angry child. That's Edom, Rome, Germany. Angry. War. That defines life. Constant conflict. Not so much in the Arab world. Stab you in the back, but not the as they smile and embrace you, mind you. No, it's part of the culture. It's all chesed. Even as they kill you, it's with love. But in the European world, it's open violence and bloodshed. That's the extreme result of Gevurah. Tzimtzum. So Tzimtzum does complete halem. When there's complete halem, there's what? There's division, deep division, conflict. Everybody's protecting their territory. Everybody's the enemy. But Yishmael, Avraham produces not that also corrupted version, a very beautiful, harmonious world, but it's all corrupt. It's all selfish. Of course, the intrigues in the Arab world are no less than in the European courts, but it's all cloaked in chesed and kind hospitality. In the Arab world, hospitality, that's, again, you invite you in, and then with the back. But it'll all be done with chesed. So it's the harem, the whole thing, this is the extreme results. Mashein Kain Yaakov, B'toste Shlema. Why? Because Tiferes doesn't produce this corruption, because it draws on the etzem, which means it remains always at every level expressive of the etzem. Yesterday we offered and said, what's the underlying principle of all of this? Is because Chesed and Gevurah is about the person and Tiferes is about the other. So this Maimon doesn't say any of this language here, but I'm telling you it's based on other places of Chassidus. And therefore, if it's based on the other, if that's the consideration, then it's always going to be appropriate. Because the question is, what do you need? What's good for you, really? That's the question. That's the driving force. And at every stage of the expression, it's going to be appropriate and not corrupted. And that's what it means by lo yischalkos. It's always about you, and therefore always produces positive results. I've kind of given the answer going ahead, but let's see it in the Maamar, as the Maamar explains, addresses the answer to what sets apart Tiferes. Beis, we're clear so far, more or less, yeah? So we have to understand what this means. We just said that the Gilui Atzmi Shabbat Torah, we just said, is re-quoting it, that the Gilui Atzmi Shabbat Torah Shebechinas Kav V'Imtzoi She'ein Bo Yishalkus. There's no division. What do you mean no division? L'chayra Eich Ef Shalom She'ein Bo Yishalkus. First of all, Arayesh Bo Oires V'Kelim. There's Yishalkus right there. There's light in this vessel. And if there's oiris and kalim, then the further down you go, the bigger the kali, the less the oiris. Change, constant change. And the first change is that like chesed and gevura, it's expressed in a certain kali. Being technical right now, just as every child starts learning chassidus, there's oiris and kalim for chesed and for gevura and for tiferes. So there's two things already. What do you mean there's no ischalkus? And what are the two things? Revelation, keli containment. As you go down, listen, the person expresses his tiferes, the keli gets stronger, the gets less. Why is it different than chesed and gevura? The way the midas tiferes rachman is in his heart is on one level. The way his heart is moved with compassion. But then as he speaks it and acts it, there's tremendous change, just like chesed and gevura. So he finally gives the whatever he does for the benefit of that person, whatever he gives him is a far cry from the pure midas harachmim in the heart, no different than chesed and gevura. Those are oiris and kalim. But I mean, there's no ischalkus. So again, I kind of gave you the answer at the beginning, but let's see how the Maamar will explain it and answer the question. This we understood by first prefacing that which is explained elsewhere. Footnote 8 is interesting. Beis HaSudas was interesting, Su'udah, an interesting meal, Yom Tov meal, that Shavuos, where the discussion was the Maamar. At any rate, so the Rebbe said then, in response to a question, that what does he mean? He means a Maamar Ve'el Shmois, Paras of the Rebbe Rashab, 1920. I just glanced briefly at the hanocha there of the meal. So the Rashab was telling the Rebbe that the Chassidim are medayik in the Rebbe's oisius and the Maamar. If they had a question, Rebbe smiled and said, "Really? So I'm not." I'm just telling you, Mitzias. And then to bring the footnote that one said on another occasion that the Mittler Rebbe that Tzemach Tzedek did not want the Chassidim to be medayik in the oisius when he said it, Hashem in the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe Davke writing for sure this diuk. Talking. Anyway, I'm just telling you, do it with it as you wish, but we are medayik. But there's stories with the Rebbe. The Rebbe said they asked the kasha. This was in the 60s, a very difficult thing the Rebbe said in the Maamar, and he asked to hear the tape. And he said, because when he's saying the Maamar, and there's Nevi'as HaMoich, and the mind is flowing, so not always the words come out Mesuder in an orderly way. That's when he's saying it. A Maamar that is Muga is something else entirely. That's very meduyik. And look at the Sichas. There's some that are medayik in letters and words, and they wasn't so happy about that. Just more the teichen. In fact, I remember recalling that the Rashak says to the Rebbe at this meal, 1963, like he's suggesting, like it was by the Fidik of the previous Rabbi, that Chassidim would come in and review the Maamar. And he would listen and correct him. The Rebbe did not want to do that, and said, that's why I give them Armakemis, go look it up, and you'll figure it out. This is Deir HaShvi. This is Deir HaShvi. It's not less, this is more. It's not repeat my words. You figure it out. In fact, it's Lekut HaSiches, Muga, and the Maimarim that the Rebbe did. It's not the way that he arranged the order, it's all different Oisias. It's the idea that it's got to come inside the Tachten also. Okay, we digress. Let's go back. That Bemis is Tiferes. It's both Maila, the Maila Mata, and the Mata Maila at the same time. It's the Rebbe's Maimer, but it's the Chassidim's words and reconstructing it, especially the last years since the Rebbe's Nistalkos. That was a tremendous work was required on the Chayzrim to hear the whole thing and reconstruct it and then write it. Before that was much easier. Very Mesuda the Fabrengen, Rashi, the Rambam, the Yitzchak. And they did it word for word, but not after Memches. You couldn't write it word for word. What came out Muga at the end was a whole new baby. They had to think it through and walk it through and discuss it and debate it and then write it, submit it, and they validated it or corrected it. But it was now the language of Chassidim, saying the Rebbe's Fabrengen from Memches on. Again, it's all out of Mashiach. That's how it is. Did it betachtoin. Das Elyon, das Tachten. One. Okay, let's go further. So understand this by first prefacing that, which it says elsewhere, and again that my metaforish pay podas. He discusses there, help to look it up. The fusion, harmony, that is the hallmark of Kavem Tzoy. Chesed is one seer, Gevura is the opposite, but the middle is Iskalulos. It's this blend, fusion of Chesed and Gevura. So there are different levels of this fusion. There's different levels of this. Iskalulos, this incorporation of two opposites, namely, lowest level. There's a kind of iskalulos that intellect will have an effect on emotion. So emotions, you have chesed, you have gevura, they're opposites. There's love, and then there is severity, there is judgment, there is discipline. They're not the same. They're opposites. But then with the influence of intellect, they can be harmonious. How so? This is the lowest level of iskalulos. What's the nature of this fusion, which we'll demonstrate in a moment? Or illustrate. It's in a way, so the pnimius of the contrary midah, that is really what is the toikef means, the force of the general midah that is determining or is being expressed on this particular occasion. Example, as the pasuk says, if a person doesn't use, leaves in the dark literally, his staff, he hates his son. If he's not going to symbolic, if you don't discipline your son, you're really hating him. And if he loves him, in the morning, he will express morning rebuke. Now, so the father therefore rebukes, disciplines his son. What you're seeing, is what? Vura. And what's the toikev? What's driving this is chesed. Why does he do this? Because he loves him. On the contrary, the pasuk is saying that the measure of true love is when the kid is not behaving, and you have to, it's easy to walk away and say, do what you want. But if you really love your child, you remain invested and you discipline and you do what's required. So here's the iskalulos of chesed and gevura. But what's the nature of the iskalulos? The inside is what? Ava. The outside is gevura. They haven't blended and become one. They're two separate, we can identify. We can really identify. Look at the Chitzonius, it's mamish gevura. The father's disciplining, is using strong language. That's all the kid sees, in fact. The kid only sees gevura. But we know, and that's the reality, that what's really motivating the previous, in the words of the Maimon, the toikev hamida, the toikev, what's forcing this is what, or fueling this is chesed. That's one level. Hine, so the last line. Even though his rebuke of him, his musar is gevura. But in truth, that is a toikev for adav chesed. It's really because he really loves it. Because he really loves his child, that's why he will employ gevura. But overall, this is a chesed moment. Because he loves him, he'll employ gevura. Externally is gevura, but the inner, it's really driving it is chesed. And that's the iskalulus. So this is the lowest level because we're still too clearly, they're working in tandem. And one's fueling the other. But inside the heart, his feelings of love, the mouth is rebuke. Two different worlds, but harmonious. Clear? However, yesh gam iskalulus b'oif, which is shnei hamidus peilim b'davar echad. But then there's a higher level of fusion where the two midas lead to the same conclusion. And they peil the same thing. It's both chesed and gevura equally leading to the same conclusion. The first example is, why am I doing this? Because I love. That's why I'm disciplining. That's the root, nothing else. Because I love, sometimes you have to, use discipline. So I'm kind of, what really motivates me is love, but I have to employ another attribute in order that my love be effective. The example is going to give now is a different example, much higher level, as it were, of fusion, where the two opposite midas lead to the same conclusion. What's the example? We actually encountered this, friends, a few years ago in the Moishe. Don't recall which one. Well, so the story there is as follows. The Gemara says like this. There was a famine in the time of David HaMelech. And David HaMelech is trying to understand why there was a famine, and he searched the whole country. There was no Avodah Zarah, and other chatoim, I don't recall exactly, that the country was not guilty of. So finally he inquired of the Eibishter why, and God tells him the following. Vayomer Hashem. And the Eibishter tells David the reason it was a 3-year famine. El Shaul, it's because of Shaul. King Saul, your father, your predecessor. Vel Beis Hadomim, and the house of blood, al asher hemis hakivonim, because he killed the Givonim. Now, what is the answer? But Dorsher Azal, so the Gemara in Yevamis and Rashi explains there that this pasuk is actually saying that Hashem is saying this for 2 reasons. This is happening. They both have to do with King Saul. What are the 2 reasons? First of all, Hashem was demanding and saying, you did not honor him appropriately. Then he would die, he was killed in battle. He was not eulogized appropriately. That's the opening, that's the first words. El Shaul. Could also be a Beis Hadomim. Domim means blood, but also means silence. So at the funeral, there was, well, could be, I have to look it up. Silence, you didn't eulogize him properly. That's one reason this famine is happening. And the second one, second half of the pasuk, Allah Shahim Givonim, because he killed the Givonim. What's the story there? In other words, a sin that Shaul did. What's the story with the Givonim? The story is that David HaMelech, who was fleeing his father-in-law who sought to kill him, Shaul was very envious of David HaMelech, his son-in-law, who was adored by the people, and everybody knows the story, right? He tried to kill him. David fled, and he took, one of the stories there was, he took refuge in the city of Noiv, which was the city of Koyanim. And Doeg, who was King Shaul's, one of his advisors, so he tells King Shaul that the Koyanim are conspiring against you and they're protecting David. In a fit of rage, Shaul has them all killed. The entire city is wiped out of the... Now the Givonim, who are the Givonim? The Givonim, you remember the story of the Givonim? The Givonim were one of the tribes that lived in Yisrael before the conquest, and they saw what was happening. So they get whole ruse there. In Sefer Yeshua, they came to Yeshua dressed like they come from a great distance. We want to make a peace pact with you, portraying themselves not as local inhabitants, which Yeshua did. And it turns out there was all a ruse. They were local inhabitants. They just wanted it. But Yeshua kept his promise and all. Shemesh begiving doim. That's the whole story there. The other tribes and kingdoms were angry at the Givonim and sought to exterminate them. And Yeshua came to defend them, and the sun was suspended in the sky. That was Gimel Tammuz. Everybody knows the story. Friday afternoon, Akaponim, but Yeshua was not happy with them, but a promise is a promise, and he relegated them to be the wood suppliers and the water suppliers for the Beis HaMikdash. So these Givonim, they would supply the Koyanim who lived in Noiv with their supplies, fire, water, and firewood for the avoid in the Beis HaMikdash. Now that Shaul had wiped out the city of Noiv, the Givonim have no panos. And that's Shaul's chet. This is all Mefarshim. Go into this, and the chet's for destroying Noiv, that's not the sin. The sin is that the Givonim lost the panos. That's not our subject. The Mefarshim explained there on Tanakh. But at any rate, the point he's bringing out here is that this famine happens for two opposite reasons. King Shaul did not get the COVID when he died. And this is a residual of this King Shaul's sin, that the Givonim were deprived of Panosa because they're not supplying the Koyanim with their needs. These two opposite cheshbonos lead to the same conclusion. So here's a greater harmony. He's chesed and gevura equally contributing to the same outcome, as opposed to the first example, where it's pure love. You're just employing discipline to have an effective love. But what's driving the whole thing is love only. Here, not. Here, it's a higher form of iskalos, where two opposite things contribute to the same conclusion. As he goes on to say, the Gemara says, the Gemara says, then Yevamis, this is what the pasuk says, Hashem mishpatei polei, which means where he is judged, polei, there we consider his good deeds. So the time when a person is being judged for his misdeeds, the same time he's also being considered his good deeds. At the same time, the judgment is a result of the good that he did and the bad that he did, and that renders the net result, the judgment. So the Gemara says, where heaven judges a person, they also mention, as for a fair judgment, his righteous acts. So both his misdeeds and his good deeds contribute equally to the net judgment. This is a higher illustration of a higher level of iskalos. The two opposite midas work in tandem to bring about the net result. We're clear? One more example. Be clear? We find the same thing with respect to the day the Beis HaMikdash was founded. The pasuk says in Yirmiyah, the Navi is talking about the Churban. And the Navi says, quoting God, as follows, Al-api of al-chamosi, this has become an expression, by the way, in the vernacular, in Yiddish, Alapi v'al-chamasi, or api v'chamasi, comes from here, which means my anger. It stoked my anger and my fury. Was this city, Yerushalayim, from the time they built it, it was vexation and angry. So what's the pasuk saying here? That was Hashem was angry from the day the Beis Mikdash was built. And yet, and the pasuk in Shir Hashirim says, the day which his heart rejoices, in Shir Hashirim, referring to the Chos and the Eibishter, what day was God's heart rejoicing? Said, Binya Beis HaMikdash. So, putting two psukim together, the day the Beis Mikdash was built, God rejoiced and was vexed, was angry. Yeah, two opposite midas. As a result of the Binya Beis HaMikdash. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow. I'll finish the next sentence. Where does this come from? This is Moichin the Gadlus. This is a very literally expanded mind, a very mature mind. That there can be two opposite considerations that lead to the same conclusion. This requires maturity. That is moved, therefore, by opposite considerations, but they all lead to one conclusion, because there is a transcendent objective here, which not only can entertain or tolerate opposite considerations, but more than that, it's the opposite considerations that lead to the conclusion. That's Moichin the Godless. That's a higher level of his scholarliness. Then we'll see tomorrow an even higher level of his scholarliness. The next thing.
Masha Enkein, when a person hits the son's friend or hits his son, it's only love.
That's what he's saying. That's two levels behind, but one level behind. That's the lower level, right? Now, why is he talking all about it? Why is it?
Is that Moichin the Katnus?
No.
No.
We wouldn't call it Moichin the Katnus, but it's not Moichin the Godless either. Moichin the Katnus is immaturity. Is immaturity. There would be the net result would be something inappropriate. So we wouldn't call it Moichin the Katnus, but it's not Moichin the Godless either. It's normal. You don't need Moichin the Godless. You love your child. You know, if you don't say no sometimes, you're destroying your kid. It doesn't require tremendous maturity. But why are we talking about this now? Why is this on the table? Let's just remember the context. Somebody? How do we get into this whole thing? The Kavem Tzoi, which is invested in or in lock. Let's finish the sentence. Why are we talking about Kavem Tzoi? Because this is what happens on Matan Torah. In the Shamas, Yisrael is invested / unlocked the Kavem Tzoi. And what did he say about that? Ein bayis chalkos. It's uniformly expressive on all of its levels. And the question is, how could this possibly be so? There's Oiris and Kalim, there's division right there at the outset. So we're approaching our answer step by step. We continued Be'ez Hashem tomorrow.